Okay, like I was saying, earlier this week, we started out factoring out greatest common factors and basic trinomials. That's two of the factoring methods. There are six in total that we focus on in this course. Um, the third method is the AC method, where you're factoring trinomials that do not have an a value of 1. And within the AC method is also grouping. That's a fourth method of factoring. So we've covered almost four. We have covered four of the six different types of factoring. So we're almost getting there. So we finished the examples A, B, C, and D. And I decided after first hour, we're not going to do the multiplying. I think you guys can do the multiplication okay. I think it's the factoring that we really need to focus on. So we're going to jump to example F. So when you are given this type of a trinomial, look at, first of all, does it have any common factors? Are there any common factors that you can factor out of all three terms? So are there any factors that 4, 3, and 10 have in common other than 1? Because everything has a factor of 1. But is there anything bigger than 1 that we can factor out from all three terms? No. Is there a variable that we could factor out from all three terms? No. Only 2 of them have an x. The third one does not. But you should always look for that first whenever you're given a factoring problem. So once you've determined there's no common factors that you can factor out, then look at how many terms there are. There are 3 terms. So it's a trinomial. Is it a basic? No, because your a value is not 1. So we can't just jump to our 2 binomials and be done in 30 seconds or less. We're going to have to put a little bit more time and effort into these ones. So how do we get that accomplished? Step number 1, set up your 4 terms. So 4 blanks. So this is a trinomial with an a value that does not equal 1. So that's how you know you need to use this method. The first term and last term stay the same. So bring those down. We're not doing E. Yeah, I decided we don't need to do any more practice of multiplication, multiplying 2 binomials. I think you guys understand that well enough. All right, so then to find your 2 middle terms, we could apply the sign rules. So this negative tells us our signs are different. So we could put 1 as a positive, 1 as a negative. But don't be deceived. Just because this says plus minus here does not mean it's always going to be plus minus here. It's because the C value is negative that these 2 signs are different. Now we're going to have to figure out what numbers go here, and we'll do that in just a second. But the middle term also has an x. So whatever the variable is for this middle term should also be part of these 2 terms. So we can set up that much without having to worry about the numbers yet. Okay? Any questions on that? Does that make sense? All right, so moving on to the numbers. Take your a value, which is 4, and your c value, which is negative 10, and multiply them together. So that equals negative 40. That's going to go at the top of your x. Your b value, the positive 3, goes at the bottom of your x. Because the 40 is negative, just like the 10 being negative, we know that there are going to be different signs. One's going to be positive, one's going to be negative here. And when it's different, think difference. For me, it's easier to think of the 2 numbers if I think difference rather than sum. So what 2 factors of 40 have a difference of 3. So if you look at your factors of 40, which pair has a difference of 3? If you subtracted them, you would get 3. 8 and 5. So we know our two numbers have to be 8 and 5. But our signs now, we're going to put those in. Your signs are different, but because that 3 is positive, the larger number has to be positive. So the larger of these two numbers is 8, the smaller is 5. So the 8 has to be positive, the 5 has to be negative. Now we're ready to put those here and here. And really, it doesn't matter whether you put the minus and then the plus, but you have to make sure that the 5 is with the negative, the 8 is with the positive. But you could have minus 5x first and then plus 8x. That doesn't matter. Those middle terms can be switched around. All right, so once you've gotten that whole step done, now you're going to factor by grouping. So when we factor by grouping, we're going to separate those first two terms from those second two terms. Focus on these first two terms. What's the greatest common factor between 4 and 8? 4. And then you have an x squared and an x, so they both have x's, which means you can factor out an x, but this one only has 1, so you can only factor out an x to the first. Since you have two terms here, you have to have two terms here. So when you factor out that greatest common factor, divide these terms by that greatest common factor to get those terms here. So the 4x squared divided by 4x would be what? What goes here? 1x. You still have your x, though. Don't forget that x squared divided by x is x. So you could put a 1 in front, but you don't have to. What about your 8x divided by 4x? What are you going to have here? 2. And it's a positive. All right. So now we move to the other group, the third and fourth term. And whatever this third sign is, must be brought down. You have to have a sign here, either a plus sign or a minus sign. 5 and 10, the greatest common factor is 5. So then divide each of these by negative 5. Negative 5x divided by negative 5 is positive 1x. Negative 10 divided by negative 5 is a positive 2. So notice when you factor out a negative, this sign changes. Be very careful with that sign. All right, that's the first step of factoring by grouping. The second step then is to factor out the binomial. So think of this as one term, think of this as another term. They both have the x plus 2 in common. So that's the greatest common factor between this group and this group. So we factor it out. So basically you're dividing both of these groups by the x plus 2. And you're putting it on the outside. And then you got the 4x minus 5 to put together at the end. These are your binomial factors. So a lot of students always are asking me, is this right? Is this right? Well, let's see. If you get your binomial factors, if you were to multiply this back together, it should equal what you started with. So how do we get the 4x squared? From multiplying the first terms together. So if I were to multiply the first terms together, would I get the first term here? Yes. So far so good. The last terms come from, if you multiply the last terms together, it should equal the last term here. Positive 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. All right, so that checks out as well. The middle term comes from your outside and inside. So if we were to multiply our outside terms together, we would get negative 5x. If we multiplied our inside terms together, we would get that positive 8x. Combined would be a positive 3x, which is our middle term. So we just checked our answer. So you can do that on your own to check your answer. Make sense? All right, let's try the next one. Again, we're not going to do the multiplying of two binomials. I think that you guys can do that just fine. We're going to focus on our factoring. You want to try starting now on your own? All right, I'm going to give you about 40 seconds to at least get step one, the setup. All right, so your first term should be 6r squared. Your second term, we're going to get the numbers in a minute, but one of these middle terms should be a positive, one should be a negative because your C value is negative. So see what I mean about these two signs are not always going to be the same as these two here, like the last problem. So the C value being negative does tell us that the signs here and here have to be different. And then your -9 is your last term that's brought down. And it doesn't matter if you put the minus first, then the plus, or the plus first, then the minus. All right, so off to the side, take that A value, multiply it by that C value, and you get -54. Your B value, -15. So now we're trying to find what factors of 54 have a difference. And again, we say difference because we know our signs are different, of 15. So look at your factors of 54. Is there a pair that has a difference of 15? 18 and 3? All right. So now the signs. If the 15 is negative, which of these two numbers has to be negative? The 18. And then the 3 has to be positive. So now we can put our numbers, we complete those four terms now with those two numbers in the middle. All right, now factor by grouping. Okay, go ahead and try doing that. So from the first two terms, you should factor out a 3r. Put that 3r out front, then divide each of these terms by 3r, and you would get 2r plus 1. So anything divided by itself is 1. Sometimes you do just have a 1 there. That's okay. The third sign is negative, so make sure you bring down that negative sign. Between 18 and 9, the greatest common factor is 9. Since it's negative, make sure you divide by a -9. So the negative divided by negative is going to be positive 2r. And the negative divided by negative will be a positive 1. So these binomials should match. If they don't match, then you either made a mistake or it can't be factored by grouping. So that's just the first step to factoring by grouping. Now, think of this as one term. Think of this as one term. What do they have in common? The 2r plus 1. So that's basically the greatest common factor between these two groups. So factor out that 2r plus 1, and then put the 3r minus 9 together. So check it. These are your binomial factors. So if I were to take the first terms and multiply them together, I should get the first term in my original trinomial, which I do. 2r times 3r is 6r squared. The last terms should multiply together to equal the last term. 1 times negative 9 is negative 9. Checks out. The middle term comes from your outside and inside. So on the outside, we've got negative 18r. The inside, we've got positive 3r. Together, we get negative 15r, which is exactly what we had in the middle. So it checks out. We know we have the correct binomial factors. Oh, actually, there is one more step to this. I forgot. I accidentally had something that could have been factored from the beginning. Look at your first three terms. You've got 6, 15, and 9. We forgot to look for greatest common factor. What's the greatest common factor between 6, 15, and 9? 3. Couldn't we have factored out a 3 at the beginning? But since we forgot, that's okay. Look at the end. The 2r plus 1 can't be factored any further, but look at your 3r minus 9. Could we factor a 3 out now from this binomial? Yes. So if we factor out a 3, I'm going to put it out front. The 2r plus 1 would stay the same, but when I divide the 3, or factor the 3 out, divide both of those terms by 3, and you get r minus 3 left over. So this is now factored completely. And if you don't factor completely, it's going to be marked wrong. So we want to make sure that we factor completely. So it would have been probably best if we had factored out that 3 from the beginning, but we didn't. So we factored it out at the end. No big deal. All right. Clean that up a little bit. There. All right, so the next two examples, I did plan for those to be multi-step problems with factoring out a greatest common factor first and then factoring by grouping or by AC method. So we got 2 more examples here, and then you're going to have 2 that I want you to try to finish up within 45 seconds is the goal. Although first hour didn't work out so well, so it took more like a minute or a minute and a half at the most. So that's okay. We'll adjust the time. All right. Anyone have any questions on example H? All right. Look at example I. So this time we're going to remember to factor out a greatest common factor first. Look at all 3 terms. So step 1 is to factor out our greatest common factor. So 30, 82, and 28. If you look at your factor sheet, what's the largest number or the largest factor that all 3 of them have in common? And sometimes it's not that big. 2. They're all even, so you know you could factor out a 2. So when we divide all 3 terms by 2, I'm going to move this up a little bit. And then the variables, as far as the variables, the third one again does not have a p, so we cannot factor out any variables. The only thing we can factor out is the 2. But our p squared will be left over. Divide this or factor out a 2 from here, we get minus 41p. Factor out a 2 from here, we get plus 14. And if we look at these three numbers, is there anything that 15, 41, and 14 would have in common other than 1? No. All right, so next we have three terms. So that tells us we're going to have to factor a trinomial. It's not a basic trinomial because your a value is not 1. So then we're going to have to use a C method. Okay, so we've been working on that. So the 2 will stay out front. We'll just kind of work with this over here. So just ignore that 2, leave it there. But then set up your 4 terms. I probably should have given you a little bit more room for this problem. So did you put your signs in there? What are your signs going to be for both of those? What does the plus tell me? If my C value is positive, what does that tell me? That tells you the signs are the same. But if the middle one is negative, they have to both be negative. So they're both going to be negative. All right, off to the side, we're going to multiply our A value times our C value, which will give us positive 210. So a little bit bigger of a number, but that's okay. We have a method of finding our two numbers. We do need to get a negative 41 in the middle. So if you can't think of the numbers off the top of your head, make a list on your own. 1 and 210, 2 and 105, 3 goes into it 70 times. 4 does not, you can't divide 210 by 4, but you can divide it by 5. 210 divided by 5 is 42. And then 6 goes into it 35 times, which I'm going to stop there because what am I looking for? I'm looking for two numbers that multiply together to equal 210, which all of these pairs are, but they have to add up to 41. Since this is a positive, think add up to 41. So have we found two numbers that add up to 41? 6 and 35. But keep in mind your signs. So they're going to be the same signs, but they're going to both be negative. 6 and 35. So that's how we get the 6 and the 35 in here. Now factor by grouping. So again, that 2, just kind of ignore it. Keep it out front. Separate your first two terms from your second two terms. The greatest common factor between the 15 and the 6, 3. P squared and P. The greatest common factor is just P to the first. So then divide both of those by the 3P, and we get 5P minus 2. That third sign is brought down. Greatest common factor between 35 and 14. 7. But remember, it's a negative 7. So when you divide by negative 7, you're going to get 5p. Positive divided by negative is negative 2. So that sign changes so that we now have that binomial in common. So these binomials have to be the same. So then factor out the binomial. Put the 3p minus 7 together. Don't forget the 2 in front. Now it's factored completely. All right, I think, let me check the time. 59. All right, we can go ahead and get started on the next one. The next one, you just need, so looking at the 3 terms, well, question first. Yeah. All right, so in this next example, if you look at 35, 16, and 3, are there any common factors other than 1 between 35, 15, and 3? No. But what do we never want to have in the front when we're factoring? A negative. So we have to factor out that negative. That's going to make the rest of your factoring process a lot easier. So please factor out that negative. Basically a -1 we're factoring out. So if we divide all these by a -1, that's going to change all of your signs. So this is going to become a positive 35x squared. This is going to become a negative 16x, and this is going to become a -3. So signs are crucial. Pay attention to your signs. Details matter. All right, so now you're going to factor this using AC method. So go ahead and try to do that on your own. If you want to ignore the -1 for a minute, fine. Work on just this trinomial. All right, so hopefully your setup is good. 35x squared plus something x minus something x. Again, if you want to put the minus before the plus, that's fine. And then -3 at the end. When you multiply your A times your C, you get a -105 at the top. Your B value, -16 at the bottom. Because it's a negative, your signs are different. So think of 2 numbers that have a difference of 16. So yes, 105 is a little bit off our factor sheet, but I believe 3, or no, what if we does 3 go into it? No. Well, it does, 3 and 35, but that's not going to work. What are my numbers? Oh, 5 and 21. I'll just give them to you. So 5 and 21. And again, if you were to make a list off to the side, if I made a list like 1 and 105, 2 doesn't go into it, 3 goes into it 35 times, 4 doesn't go into 105, but 5 goes into it 21 times. So somewhere off to the side, make a little list of your factors of 105 to help you get these 2 numbers. So the larger one needs to be negative. So 21 has to be negative, 5 has to be positive. So I'm going to put my 5 here, my 21 there. Then split the two terms or the four terms in half. I don't like when people use parentheses here, because if you use parentheses, it indicates that you're multiplying, and we are not multiplying these things right now. We are factoring them out. So to look at the first two terms, what's the greatest common factor between 35 and 5? 5. And then between x squared and x, x. So then if you divide both of these terms by 5x, you get 7x plus 1. The next two terms, make sure you factor out that minus. Greatest common factor between 21 and 3 is 3. So if I divide both terms by negative 3, I'll get 7x plus 1 again to match this binomial here. So if they don't match, you made a mistake, or it's possible that these things cannot be factored by grouping. So from here, think of this as one term, think of this as one term. They have the 7x plus 1 in common, so factor it out, which is basically you're dividing both groups by that binomial, and you have the 5x minus 3 left over. So these are your two binomial factors. However, if you put this in as your answer, you're going to get it wrong, because what did I forget? The negative 1 in the beginning. So that negative 1 that was factored out in the beginning has to be part of the final factors at the end. All right, so the ones that I'm giving you are not going to be multi-step. They're not going to have anything to be factored out in the beginning, but they are using the AC method. It is a they are going to be trinomials with an A value that's not 1. So we ready? Okay, pencils ready. First term, 5a squared. Middle term, plus 16a. 5a squared plus 16a plus 12. Go. Thank you. So hopefully this wasn't too difficult figuring out the two numbers that multiply together equal 60, but add up to 16, 6 and 10, or 10 and 6. It does not matter what order. The signs have to be the same. They both have to be positive. So everyone hopefully got that step. From there, factor by grouping. I'll wait a minute because I know that some of you have not gotten that far. Good. All right, so we're getting there. Since there's the greatest common factor between 5 and 6 is 1. If you want to put a 1, that's fine, but don't forget to look at the variables. Both have an a, so you're going to factor out the smaller amount, the a to the first, and then if we divide both terms by that 1a, we get 5a plus 6, because the a here is going to reduce. From the second two terms, bring down that plus. You can factor out a 2, but you cannot factor out an a. So sometimes you factor out a variable, sometimes you factor out just a number, sometimes it's both a variable and a number. Just depends. So when you divide both of these by 2, we now have 5a plus 6 again. So now from both groups, you can see we have a 5a plus 6 in common. So I factor that out and put the a plus 2 together. If you want to put the 1 in front, that's fine, but it's not necessary. All right, so about half of you did pretty well on that. Got it within probably a minute or two. Good job. The others just keep working at it. You got part of it. It just takes practice. All right. One more. So this time I'm going to give you one that has a minus, a negative C value. So you'll have to find two numbers that will have a difference of something. So here we go. Your first term is 6r squared. It's very similar to one of the examples, but not exactly the same. Middle term, plus 25r. Last term, minus or negative 9. 6r squared plus 25r minus 9. Factor, go. So keep in mind when you're looking for your two numbers, because that C value is negative, and you're going to get a negative 54, you're looking for two numbers that have a difference of 25. So if you were to subtract the two numbers, you would get 25. You're ready for your homework. Go ahead and start working on your assignment. All right. So if you look at your lists of the factors of 54, you don't really have to go very far. 2 and 27. Because the signs are different, like I said, you're looking for two numbers that have a difference, or if you subtracted them, you would get 25. So the signs do have to be different, but the larger one has to be positive. So the 27 is your larger number. So that would be your positive. The 2 will be your negative. So again, if you multiplied them together, you would get negative 54. If you added the positive with the negative, you would get a positive 25. Oops, 7. All right, so now that we put the positive 27R in and the negative 2R, factor by grouping, you can factor out a 3R from the first two, giving you 2R plus 9 left over. From these two, factor out a negative 1. So you do need to put a 1 here because it's 1 is the only thing they have in common. So sometimes you do need to put a 1, but you don't have to put a 1 if it's in the front. You do need to put the 1 if it's in the middle. So if I divide both of these terms by negative 1, they will change their signs. 2R plus 9, but you're not done here, okay? This is just the second to last step. You're almost there. Think of this as one term. Think of this as one term. They both have the 2R plus 9 in common. Factor it out, and then put the 3R minus 1 together. All right, so you are ready for your assignment. It is in Math Excel. If you have not finished the Delta Math assignment, make sure you get that one done. And then the rest of the hour, you can work on the other one.